Hi there. We're back together again for a new book, a new I Survived series. And this one is the I Survived the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And I'm so eager to read this book with you that I'm reading it to you even though it's soaking wet. I spilled my iced tea on it, but I'm still going to read, but I may stumble because some of the words show through the pages. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this book before we started. These books get pretty exciting and a little scary sometimes, but they have a lot of facts in them that are true. It's a historical fiction. So there really was a fire in Chicago in 1871. But the actual story is not true. It's a historical fiction, as are all the I Survived books. But the last one we read about the grizzly bears was really fun because we learned so many facts about Glacier National Park and about grizzly bears and about taking care of our environment and that kind of thing. And this is similar. And I wanted to share a thought with you. When I read a book, what I like to do before I start reading the book is learn a little bit, as much as I can, about the author or any other interesting facts that might help me. And the way I do that is I always read the back cover because it gives me an idea what the book is about. And if you start there, and if you don't understand what the back cover is telling you, maybe an adult can help you. So it helps frame what's happening in the book to help you understand the whole plot. If it's a little difficult for you in terms of reading, it's just a fun way. So I'm going to start by reading that to you. Oscar Starling never wanted to come to Chicago. But then Oscar finds himself not just in the heart of the big city, but in the middle of a terrible fire. No one knows exactly how it began, but one thing is clear. Chicago is like a giant powder keg about to explode. An army of firemen is trying to help, but this fire is a ferocious beast that wants to devour everything in its path, including Oscar. Will Oscar survive one of the most famous and devastating fires in history? So that's what the back cover tells us. So that's what we're about to read. But the other thing that this book does that I think is fun is it gives us some facts at the very back of the book. And I think that's fun too, because as I'm reading, I always say to myself, I wonder if that's true. I wonder if that's true. And what this story tells us is that 1/3, 1 out of every 3 people in Chicago at that time lost their house to this fire. So a lot of people lost their home in this fire. But what happened right after the fire, all kinds of help came out. Train loads and truckloads full, not trucks, there was horse and buggy in these days, but all kinds of food and blankets and clothes came to help the people who had lost their homes. And so those are just 2 facts. And there were 185 firefighters, and they had 17 horse-drawn steam engines that they used. And the other thing that's kind of fun about this to know is that the day before there had been also a very big fire. And so the firemen were very tired. And everything was built of wood in those days. So like our cities are built with bricks and steel and concrete. In those days, Chicago was dirt roads, horse and buggies, and everything, including the sidewalks, were built from wood. And so it had been a very, very dry season, a very dry year. So everything was very dry. And it probably was, they do know that it started in a barn. Mrs. O'Leary's cow, the story was that Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocked over a lantern and started the fire. We don't know for sure that that's what really happened, but we do know that the fire started in Mrs. O'Leary's barn. So those are some of the facts going into this story, and I think it's fun just to know those before we start reading the story. So again, this is set in 1871, and at that time in Chicago. Now, do you know where Chicago is? You may want to take out a map or go online and see if you can find the city of Chicago. It's called the Windy City, and the reason it's called the Windy City is it's right on Lake Michigan. It's the biggest city in Chicago, and it sits right on Lake Michigan, and the wind blows off that lake, and it's very strong, and it's very cold. And so that is where Chicago is. And Chicago was a city where there were cows and pigs running through the city at the time of this, 1871. And it was really not until about almost 1900 where they started to really clean up the city and make it more of a modern city. And so this is happening back when it was still kind of a cow town, literally, lots of cows. So it was a Sunday at 11:30 p.m. Most people were sleeping. The fire started inside a barn. It was tiny at first, a glowing dot, some wisp of white smoke, but then flames reached up. They grabbed hold of a pile of hay. Crackle, pop, and then boom! Towers of flames shot up higher and higher, punching through the roof, reaching for the sky. Voices screamed out, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" Alarm bells clanged. Firemen readied their horses and raced their pumpsters toward the streets, but it was too late. The flames blasted a shower of fiery sparks into the windy city. Like a swarm of flaming wasps, they flew through the air, starting fires wherever they landed. Shops and homes erupted in flames, warehouses exploded, and mansions burned. Crowds of panicked people fled their homes in their pajamas and rushed through the streets and along the wooden sidewalks. They screamed and pushed and knocked one another down, desperate to get away from the choking smoke and the boiling flames. But there was no escape. The wind blew harder. Flames shot hundreds of feet in the air, spreading across miles and miles. And in the middle of all that was 11-year-old Oscar Starling. Oscar had never felt so terrified, not even 2 years ago when a killer blizzard hit his family's Minnesota farm. He was trapped inside a burning house fighting for his life. He made it downstairs, desperate to escape, and then crash. A ball of fire and cinders crashed through the window and the house exploded in flames. And suddenly Oscar was in the fire's ferocious grip. The flames clawed at him, searing him, threw him to the ground. Smoke gushed up his nose and into his mouth. But the worst was the blistering heat and the feeling of being almost roasted alive. Was this the end of Oscar? He had never wanted to come to this city in the first place, and now he was sure he was going to die here. That sounds terrible. All right, I'm going to try to read one more chapter, and that'll be it for today because we only have 15 minutes. Let's see how long it's going to be. We'll try. 3 hours later, a train to Chicago. Don't puke. That's what Oscar had been telling himself for the past 9 hours as the train chugged and swayed and jerked its way into Chicago. They'd crossed 400 miles of wide open prairie. For hours, Oscar had been staring out the window. There had been nothing to see but shoulder-high grass and a few scrawny buffalo that seemed to wave goodbye to Oscar with their swishing tails. Now they were getting closer to the city. Oscar couldn't bear to look. He slouched down in his seat and glued his eyes to his dusty boots. "Are you feeling okay, Oscar?" Mrs. Morrow asked. "Yes, I'm fine," Oscar lied. "Such a long trip," Mama said, her freckled face shining with excitement. "I feel like we're heading up to the moon." Mama and Mr. Morrow both laughed, but nothing seemed funny to Oscar. So much had happened in these last few weeks, he was in a state of shock. Mama had married Mr. Morrow. They had sold their Minnesota farm where Oscar had lived his entire life, and now they were moving to a strange city that might as well be the moon. No wonder Oscar felt sick. Of course, the real nightmare had happened 2 years earlier when Papa died. He was killed in the ferocious blizzard, a wall of ice and snow and wind that slammed into their prairie town with no warning. Papa had been trying to get home, his wagon crushed into a tree in the blinding snow. Even now, Oscar couldn't believe that Papa was gone. Papa was the toughest man Oscar knew. He'd been the sheriff of Dakota Territory. He'd survived a gunfight with one of the most brutal outlaws in the West. He'd carved a farm out of 40 acres of wild prairie. Papa was Oscar's hero. Those first few weeks after Papa died, Oscar was sure his sadness would rip him apart. But he couldn't just lie in bed sobbing. With Papa gone, it was Oscar's job to help Mama with the farm. He made a whimpering promise to Papa to watch over the farm, to work as hard as he could to keep it going. He worked from dawn until after school, and he worked so hard he fell into bed every night, too exhausted to think. Mama wanted Oscar to see his friends. "Maybe tomorrow," Oscar always answered. "Then come and sit with me for a while," Mama would say. "Let's play cards." He and Mama and Papa used to play fierce games of hearts. When Papa lost, he'd pretend to fly into a rage, pounding the table while Mama and Oscar bubbled with laughter. But Oscar had no time for cards. All he wanted to do was work. The seasons passed in a blur of sweat and dirt and aching muscles, and Oscar would have to keep going. But then 6 months ago, Mr. Charlie Morrow appeared at their door. Mr. Morrow was an artist for a big Chicago newspaper. He'd come to Castle for his latest project, which was to paint scenes of life in a blooming little prairie town. Mama was honored when Mr. Morrow stepped up and asked if he would paint their farm. Each morning for a month, Mr. Morrow would show up for just about as the sun rose, waving to Mama and Oscar with his painting-stained fingers. "Hello," he'd shout out. He was a big man with jet black hair and a beard to match. Mama said he reminded her of a giant from a fairy tale. But a nice kind, she explained. Oscar liked Mr. Morrow well enough. He made Mama smile, that was for sure. Most nights after Mr. Morrow packed up his paints, he joined them for supper. Afterward, he and Mama would sit out on the porch and look over the day's paintings. "Oscar, join us," Mr. Morrow would boom. But why didn't Oscar need to look at the paintings of his farm? He lived there. So he'd make excuses, and then he'd fall asleep to the sound of Mr. Morrow and Mom's soft laughter drifting upstairs. After Mr. Morrow went back to Chicago, Mama seemed to get a letter from him every single day. But maybe Oscar shouldn't have been shocked when 2 months ago, Mama sat Oscar down under the apple tree with some big news. "Oscar asked me to marry him," she said. Mr. Morrow asked me to marry him," she said. At first, Oscar laughed. "Mr. Morrow? He was nothing like Papa. He was an artist. An artist! Was that even a job?" But then Oscar noticed how Mama's eyes were twinkling. "Oscar," she said, "I want to say yes." Oscar stopped laughing. "He's a wonderful man," she said, "and what a life we'll have with him in Chicago." At first, Oscar just sat there like he'd been smacked in the head with a shovel. Leave the farm? Move to Chicago? What about his promise to Papa? Oscar begged Mama. He pleaded with her. He tried to make her understand that they needed to stay in Castle. "Papa wouldn't want us to leave here," he explained. But then Mama looked at Oscar with her hopeful eyes. "Oscar," she said quietly, putting her hand onto Oscar's cheek. Her fingers were like Oscar's, covered with calluses and scars from all the scrubbing and weeding and washing that filled her day. "All Papa ever wanted was for us to be happy." And Oscar could see that she had made up her mind. Oscar would have to run away or refuse to, he could run away or refuse to get on the train, but he didn't have the guts. So now here he was, miserable, chugging along with his stomach turning inside. The train whistle shrieked, "Woo, woo! Chicago!" the conductor shouted, 10 minutes! Oscar's stomach flipped. "Don't puke," he said to himself. His stomach didn't listen. He managed to slam open the window just in time to splatter his lunch across the tracks. Welcome to Chicago. All right, that was 2 chapters. Tomorrow we'll start chapter 3. See you then. Bye.